Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Kasey Lansdale.
Joe Lansdale.
Hi there. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Good. Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. So I want to start off by saying, can you tell me about yourselves?
Ooh, and go. Dad, you want to take it or you want me to go?
Yeah, I will. I was born in East Texas and I've lived there all my life. I've traveled a lot, but most of my work is influenced by living in East Texas. Comic books got me started when I was 4, trying to write comic books and draw them. And I found out I was a better writer than I was an artist. So I just continued onward. And eventually, I was 21, I started selling. When I was 29, I was full time. I did all kinds of jobs in between those. But I'm still doing it. I'm still in East Texas. I'm still writing. I've done films. I've done novels and short stories and articles and poetry and comics. I can't even remember everything, but a lot.
Yeah. Shocking. I'm also from East Texas. And I currently live in Los Angeles. So I guess, was born into this world. I've done a lot of things. I spent most of my life as a touring musician. During pandemic, that was suddenly hindered. And so the writing that I had always done since I was a child, which had leaned more into songwriting, but had always sort of dabbled in fiction, sort of grew. And my father and I, about a decade ago, had written a couple short stories with 2 characters in them. And we thought, well, let's give it a new life now that we sort of know who those characters are. And that's how the comic came about. But I now do a lot of work behind the scenes in film and television, as well as I just finished some other projects that I can't quite talk about. But yeah, it just feels like we're part of this family dynamic, whether we meant to be or not.
Yeah. My son is also in the business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is so incredible. I love, occasionally I'll get like these really creative families that come on the show. And I think that's such a...
We didn't say we were creative. We just said we all do it. We do our best. We do our best.
So doing your best, I'm curious, what was that like for, both of you have different perspectives, obviously, growing up with these like inclinations toward writing and songwriting and all of these other pursuits. Can you both share your experiences?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just sort of natural. I didn't really put much thought into it because that was what, by the time I came around, both my parents worked from home. That was not the case previously. My mother worked as a dispatch at the fire department, the police department. My father had a smattering of different jobs. But about the time I was born is when they started kind of cooking, and it made more sense for my mom to work at home. So I didn't think anything of it. I was just like, this is what you do. You wake up, you create a thing, and then when you're done with that, you live the rest of your life. So mine leaned, like I mentioned, more into the musical side of things. Mm-hmm. But my first publication was a co-written piece with my father and my brother when I was about 8. And fast forward X amount of years later, and it's now a Creep Show episode. So it's, so many things that you don't think are going to have legs. And then 20 years later, they've turned into this whole different thing. So I think it was less like a conscious decision and more like, that's just what you do. You wake up, you go create a thing and, move on with your life.
Well, she really put in a lot in singing, and we always thought she was going to be a singer full time, all the time, and she still is, but she's also got other pursuits now. So being a writer of stories and stuff kind of surprised me. Her mom used to say her life was a musical because they would go to Walmart and she'd be pushing her in the basket and Kasey would be singing at the top of her voice, But for me, I've always wanted to do it. And when I was a kid, I was given a stack of comic books and they got me started. And I was, I dabbled in it all the time through teenager and all that. And then when I was 21, I met my wife. And a few years later, we had a goat dairy. I farmed. I worked in the rose field. She did too. But she's got a job in a freezer truck unit where they carried lunch meat and things like that, and they would bring it to different 7-Eleven or something of that nature. And my job at that time was working outdoors, and it came a brutal winter, and my wife said, why don't you take 3 months off and just write fiction? I'd already been selling nonfiction, And I said, okay. And she said, well, when I come home, you better have something done. And I thought, uh-oh, I better have something done. And I did. And I wrote 90 stories, none of which were very good, but they taught me how to get the junk out of my system, you know? And so it took over 4 years, because back then we had to put them in mail, you know, and mail them. And there were more markets. So I could send one of those stories to 10, 15 markets, you know. And I sent some to markets that really weren't interested in that kind of fiction at all. But I didn't know. I'd never met an author or an agent or an editor or anybody in the business. I lived out in the woods. And over 4 years, I got 1,000 rejects on all those stories. Literally 1,000 rejects. Yeah.
And then now here you are today. That is
Yeah,
so interesting.
that had a lot to do with it. I always credit my wife with me becoming a successful writer and a full-time writer. And because she was the one I wanted to please, I wanted to write, but I wanted her to be proud of me, you know? So what happened is that it just got better and better. And then I had this moment when I sold 2 books back to back. I had a little bit of ghost work lined up. And so I went full time. And immediately the ghost work died because the guy that wanted me to do it had a fight with his publisher. So I'm struggling again for 3 years, but, you know, making some money. And then things hit. And then when Kasey arrived, about when she showed up, that's about when I really started cooking, because we knew we were going to need the money.
I was going to say it was about to get expensive.
Yeah.
This one's going to cost. Keith was just more, you know, whatever. But I thought, this one's going to cost.
Yeah. Now it's funny, you know, because I think about it and it's like I did, you know, probably every job you could do in our town, waitress and fast food, you know, pizza joints, all those things. And it became very clear to me very quickly that I did not want to continue doing those things. So I thought I'm going to continue to dabble in this side thing that, you know, makes me happy and allows me to be creative while I'm doing these gigs and these touring efforts. And, you know, it just sort of became its own 9 to 5, you know, but what you realize very quickly is when you work for yourself, it's 24/7.
Yeah.
So very, very different needs and demands, but dare I say more fulfilling at least.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
She can do anything. Everything she does, she excels. So, and that's kind of part of the whole Lansdale problem is we all want to do everything.
The blessing and the curse. So that's been a lot of it. I mean, and I think that's where when pandemic hit, it gave me an opportunity to sort of peel back everything external. You know, at the time I was doing a lot of different things. I was doing auditions, I was doing commercial work, I was writing, I was doing music, I had a residence, you know, it was one thing after another, and they all brought me joy and they all fulfilled a different need. But when it was suddenly all taken away, I sort of realized, you know, it's okay not to sort of run it at the candle at both ends and focus and kind of hone in on something. And that's what I've been able to do. And it's been a more pleasurable experience because I didn't realize how spread thin I was until I wasn't.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
She sold a lot of short stories before, you know, besides the ones we've written together. I mean, she's been busy as a short story writer and working on a novel, that kind of thing.
Well, that's what's fun. You know, I finished my novel. My agent has it now, and I'm working on a second one. And it's, you know, I think it's the usual thing of because it wasn't the primary focus, you know, it wasn't the topic of conversation. So I think a lot of people don't understand that the characters for the comic book that we're working on have existed for a long time. And even before I came into the picture, one of those characters was around when I edited an anthology over a decade ago. I actually had a horror anthology and Dad wrote a story with that character that he submitted. I accepted it. And, you know, so it was funny that it came kind of full circle from here's a character in this story in an anthology that I'm only editing, cut to now we live in that universe and write in that universe together.
Well, you know, it was an accident, though, that it happened is I had written 3 maybe stories about this character, and then Kasey wanted to collaborate, which I did not want to do. I don't like collaboration.
Right. Well, to be fair, Christopher Golden wanted us to collaborate.
So go ahead and tell them.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was Dad and I had written the story, you know, when I was younger together, and then I'd been writing some things independently, and I don't think we collaborated after that until that story with Christopher Golden. So I mean, that's you're looking at almost 20 years, 15 years. I don't know how numbers work anymore, but we didn't work together until Christopher Golden wanted to do an anthology. And he said, Joe, do you want to collaborate with anybody? And he said, no, I don't really do much collaboration. And then Chris happened to be a friend of mine, and he wrote me and he said, do you think your dad would collaborate with you? I know he did it a long time ago. We really want him in this book. What do you think? I said, I don't know, and I asked him, and Dad said, no, I don't do that. And then I wrote 3 or 4 pages, I can't remember, and I shot it over to him in an email. And I said, all right, Chris, just wait. Because I knew that if I sent over a partial story, it would kill Dad not to work on it. I knew just having it hanging in his inbox wasn't going to work. So, true to form, a few days later, I get an email, something like, you're evil, here's 3 more pages, and then that sort of was the beginning. Yeah. So I definitely weaseled in on that. But I knew that we would have a good time, and I knew that I believed that he was ready for that, because it was a different thing. He'd been doing his own thing, and I thought, well, he's collaborated before. We've collaborated together as a family, but here's another opportunity. And if nothing else, it'll give us one story that we did that, we can have a tangible thing as a family. I don't think we ever realized that we were going to take that character out of that story, put it in this other universe, and just build. But we had so much fun with them.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I'm sorry. I'm stepped on you there. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. What were you going to say? I want to hear.
No, I was just going to say, when she created that character, we weren't thinking about it, of Jana becoming part of the universe with Dana Roberts, or we wouldn't have named them Dana and Jana.
Yeah, that you can always tell it wasn't on purpose, because we always see because we can't even get it. It's Dana and Jana, but when you try to say it fast, forget about
Dana
it.
And
Betty and Sue.
Yeah.
But we just combined them. They fit.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I have to ask, what about collaboration do you not like?
Collaborating.
Well, I'm going to tell you what I didn't like at first.
Okay.
What I realized is we weren't always writing the same story. So I understood very quickly that we had to do something that Dad did not like, which was plot out a little bit to make sure that we were hitting the same points and had the same goals. So I'm going to let that be your jump off.
Well, the thing is that I didn't like collaborating, but once I collaborated with Kasey and later with my son, I found that I could collaborate with my kids really well, and I learned a lot from them. They knew things I didn't know, and they had ideas that I thought were really good, and I thought, oh, okay, that's better than what I got. But I think that I found it was really natural with Kasey and I honestly think that one of us could go to the bathroom and the other person could sit down where they had left off and just start working. And I don't think you could tell us apart much, especially now, then it was a little bit more, obvious because, she's got more control now. She understands the story, and she has her own voice. And the truth of the matter is after that first story that we did together with the 2 characters, she kind of took over at that point. And nearly all I think, except maybe one story that we've written together, she started all of them, and she jumped off with them, and they're told from her character's point of view, which before they weren't. And
so it was definitely, it gave me a chance to sort of take the helm on it. And, I had veto power, because at the end of the day, I was like, a woman wouldn't say that, or I wouldn't say that, or, so it gave me a different sort of control than I might otherwise if I were coming in on one of Dad's characters in a different way.
But I was the senior. I always,
Yeah. And that was the thing too, is like, if there was something that he felt really strongly about, it didn't bother me to kind of acquiesce, because at the end of the day, he's got a much longer history of doing this. So I figure if he felt strongly about it in that way, then that's okay. And most of the time he was okay with just sort of letting our character, tell the story in her voice, which that character, Jana, is very much me. And me, if I weren't censored, and me, if I didn't understand how social interaction worked, or chose not to respect it.
Yeah.
And I think part of, what were you going to say?
I always thought that the choices she made were 99% the choices that I wished I would had thought of, So they're kind of her lead on those stories. I'm sorry, though. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that a big part of collaboration, in my opinion, at least, is the closeness with someone else. And like, friendship with someone else can really help strengthen the story because you know how to write kind of in their voice and you can kind of blend together in that way. And it sounds like you two really found that, which is getting family connection definitely helps there.
I definitely have written with people that are from a completely different background and very quickly realize like, oh, that doesn't have the same power to it. It doesn't feel as good. And because even, it's all about when you write, you try to be honest and kind of write what you know. And I realized if I wasn't writing with someone that I was close to in that way on that level, then I wasn't writing what I knew and it felt false. And it felt false to me. So I knew that it would feel false to a reader.
Yeah. I have a friend, Lou Shiner, and we're really good friends, but we wrote and collaborated together and sold some stories, but we'd have hell. I would write it and say, can you go with that? And he'd go, no, I can't go with that. I don't know what happens next. And then we would write it and he would take out all the good stuff I put in. Then he'd send his and I'd take out all the good stuff he put in. Oh, so we didn't always agree on what was the good stuff, so.
By the end, you had like one sentence.
Yeah. I think Kasey and I do that too, but not to that degree.
I think we more top each other. I think now it's more a fun thing. The comic for a perfect example that like some of it got kind of goofy, but it was not necessarily intentional, but not intentional. It was like, we just wanted to see how much we could explore. And then we started kind of having, there's one scene in there with the balloon animals and it was a much bigger, crazier scene. And Steve at Dead Sky eventually was like, okay, you guys got to pull this back. You're getting a little wild, but we just had a great time with it. Yeah.
And
okay, you've got to tell me what the original scene was.
It wasn't even, the original scene, and it's been a minute since we did it, but the original scene, my memory was much scarier. It was much more tense and there were humorous moments, but I think also Jana, the character that I had brought in, didn't have the confidence in the first one to kind of speak up in a way with Dana. And I think that was reflective of me not feeling like I had the confidence to put my character forward. So it definitely was more, I'm going to use the word stiff, maybe lean is the better word, but it was definitely less humorous, even though there were funny moments. But I felt like the comic allowed for our sense of humor to sort of shine better or worse,
Yeah. And humor makes things more scary to me sometimes because here's this ridiculousness amongst all these horrible things that are happening. But let's just put it this way: there were no balloon animals in the short.
Not a one.
So how was writing this project, writing for comics, different than your other writing creative pursuits?
Dad, you want to?
Yeah, well, I've been writing comics for a long, long time, since the 90s. And as a kid, like I said, I tried to write them. But for me, it wasn't difficult to write it as a comic, but it was difficult sometimes to make a choice in the story about what you're going to take out or what you're going to modify because you have less space. You have a certain limit of pages that you have to get it in. If you're writing the story, we could fudge a little and go over and do more. And you also have to think of it as a visual medium. Now, I write very visual anyway. That's my whole approach to things. But this is actually visual and the person picks it up and they should be able to look at the panel and know what's going on without too much explanation. And you had to make, we had some really cool lines in the story and I loved them. And I wish we'd been able to put them all in, but we had a limit to the number of pages and how much we could clutter a panel. So those are some of the differences, I think, and making something that had a remarkable image and that was very explanatory as soon as you looked at it. I think that's the big difference for me, and having to meet that page limit, which is probably the hardest part of me with comics.
Yeah, I think for me it was I'd written a couple comics before, literally two, and this was the third comic. And my hardest thing is definitely, and I compare it, it's like sending out a tweet versus putting a Facebook message.
Yeah.
Like you've got all this room and you can kind of elaborate on all these different things. And whereas with the tweet, you have to keep it in 140 characters. And the best advice I got was from a friend of mine. He said, what did he say? Is your friend and is your enemy. And I had to think of that every time. There's no and because one action per panel. And that Dad kept saying one action per panel because I'd be like, well, let's do this and this. And he's like, well, how are they going to draw this and this at the same time? And I was like, that is an excellent question. So it definitely made me appreciate the skill of not only comic writing, but screenplay writing. And
The
how that
artist.
is, yeah. And the good thing is we ended up with a great artist who is a friend of ours, and we knew going in he was going to be doing the art. So there were moments when we would say, Danny, do your thing. It needs to be this, this, and this, go nuts. And of course he would go in and we sort of had a sense of how he would interpret most of it. And then there were some moments that we were like, oh, that's not what we thought at all. Most of the time that turns out to be more interesting. Every once in a while, it's like, that's not really showing what we meant for it to, or what we intended. So maybe one little tweak here, one little tweak there. But, the benefit of working with people that are already skilled is that we don't have to worry that once we put the ball in their court, that they're going to take it off on the rails. And it's another form of collaboration. So for me, it was fun to collaborate in a way that didn't feel conflicting, because I'm not going to go in and tell him how to do art at all. I have no feedback on that, no notes.
Here's my
But
little stick figures.
yeah, I mean, so it was neat to collaborate in a way where it didn't matter really what I would have done, because there is no what I would have done.
Right. Right. And what's funny is I've had people who have read the short story and then read the comics and, well, I missed all that dialogue that I want. And again, it's the space. And then I've had people that had never read the short story, but read the comic and then read the short story and said, but you left out like the balloon animals and stuff.
Yeah.
So you can't please everybody, but and I think it's important to, I generally don't like someone to take something of mine and change it so much I can't recognize it. Sometimes I think that has to be. Sometimes you have a little sliver of an idea, a really short story that somebody has to do more with. Like my son adapted one of my stories into a screenplay and he had to do more or it'd have been a really short film. But I do think that even within that context of trying to maintain its integrity doesn't mean that you can't play with it a little bit and that you can't bring a little something different that wasn't in the original piece. I just think it's a balance.
Absolutely.
And it's not an easy balance.
So kind of talking on kind of continuing this thread, I'm curious, what was it about horror specifically that interested the two of you when you guys were writing? And just, I mean, in general, I know both of you have written a lot of horror outside of this project, of course.
Yeah, what I would say is that horror is just one of the many things I'm interested in, and I've written more crime fiction than I have anything else. But I'm always called a horror writer, which I don't like to be called a crime writer or a horror writer. I'm a writer, and I feel like that limits how people think about me. And horror is very much, unfortunately, a ghetto. And once you get into that ghetto, nobody can visualize you outside of it. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some delightful moments inside the old ghetto. But what it means is that it limits the way people think about you as a writer, and that no matter what you do forever, that's what you are. And I am that. So somebody said, that's a horror story you wrote. I go, yeah, you're a horror writer. No, I wrote horror that time, but I have a broader view of it. And as much as I love horror, it's not the only thing I care about, and most of what I read isn't horror. That doesn't mean I haven't read extensively in horror. I have, and I will read horror again, but most of my reading is outside of that.
Because we write a lot where there's a crossover. So if you write a horror story that's purely horror, that's one thing. But I think most of the things that Joe does, that I do, is we write across genres. Our horror has a little bit of suspense, or our crime has a little bit of supernatural. And I think what his point is if we only label it as one thing, we're stunted on how we can move forward, not only in the way people perceive, but I think the way we perceive ourselves. And if we continue to put ourselves in that box of I am only this thing, then I think we get maybe afraid to step out of that box. And that's not fun either as a creative, because you don't want to always be trapped into this cycle where you only have to do this one thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she nailed it. I have friends of mine that feel that way. They're scared to step outside of that box because they're not accustomed to it. And they're also afraid they'll alienate their readers. I've always said, right, like everybody is dead. Write for yourself.
That's really good advice.
Rarely do I write for anybody else. I mean, if I'm asked to do an introduction, then I'm writing about somebody else. then that's a little bit different. But still, when you're writing stories and novels, if you're sitting there thinking about, I wonder what so and so is going to think, I wonder what the agent's going to think, you're going to end up with some crap. I mean, if you do it enough, you kind of have a knowledge of when you're expanding the envelope beyond the normal readership. But I just, I can't worry about that. And I have to, write what I want to write. And most of the time I have the feeling that if it comes out something I like, there'll be others who like it. And that seems to be the case.
Absolutely. I mean, some of my favorite people that I've had on this show, I've had on for one genre, actually usually horror. And then the next time they come on, it's something completely different. And we get to have a totally different conversation about, like, there was one author I had on who wrote this excellent thriller novel. And she was saying, like, well, I'm a thriller author and all that stuff. And the next time I had her on, she wrote a rom-com.
Yeah.
And we talked about that. I'm like, you know what? This book was also fantastic, completely different, but it gave a totally unique conversation. And I think that's one of the privileges that we have as authors, is that we can kind of hop around more and get away with it better than some of the other.
I think a lot of people don't think about the fact that it takes them, a few minutes to read a short story or a few hours to read a novel, but we're with it longer than that.
Mhm.
And so we have to really love what we're doing. And the other thing too is that readers are as bad as publishers in that they get used to. I saw a review of mine today, and it was a great review. But they said, "But it isn't Happen Leonard." I thought, you noticed it isn't a Happen Leonard story. No joke. Why hadn't they? I mean, what is that? I mean, and one of my favorites is I think it was an anthology that George Martin did that I did a story for, and a bunch of other people. But the guy says, "Well, I just didn't like this. There wasn't any zombies in it." Well, why should there be? So people like that are so narrow that they get to where they only want to read one thing. And then what they end up doing is burning themselves out. They're just reading the same kind of story over and over. Even if it's a good one, they no longer appreciate it. And one of the advantages to writing a different things and reading a lot of different things is that you can switch. And then sometimes if you come back to horror, it's fresher and you have a
Well,
better
it's fun again.
Yeah, it's fun again. And most of the horror I like, and like Kasey was kind of saying, isn't really strictly pure horror. There are exceptions. I've written some pure horror, but a lot of my stuff, you see reviews say this is hard to classify. And I think, well, yeah, that's true. That's
I
the
think
most
having it hard to classify means you did your job well,
Yes.
personally. I
Yeah.
think that's a good sign. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to think it's not just rowing a boat from one side of the river to the other. It's what's in the boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for sure. So this is a little bit more of a specific question, but what is your number one favorite piece of writing advice? And whether that be something that you've given out or something that you've received or both.
I
I gave
got
mine.
one for that Dad gave me.
Oh,
And,
all right.
and yeah, and it's probably been the most helpful, other than Right Like Everyone You Know Is Dead, which also is helpful, but in a different way. The best advice he gave me is if you write 1 page a day, you got a book in a year, and you're probably going to write more than 1 page a day. So that to me took the pressure off, because you realize, like, okay, most people, if they write the book in the year, that's kind of standard. And I was able to get done with the one that I was doing a little faster, because the whole mindset was, if I just get 1 page a day, that's all that anybody needs of me, and I can move on and be okay. So that just sort of helped me psychologically not feel the mounting pressure of 350 pages.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that Right Like Everybody You Know Is Dead is the best piece of advice I've ever given to anybody or given to myself. But I also just kind of generally, I think people think that I'm a writer. I now have to go in here and start writing, and I write from, 9 to 5 or whatever, but you don't have to. I write every day unless something just, wrecks my day, or I have to, do something that's just unavoidable. But I write every day, and my deal is I only write 3 hours a day. And I'm lying about that half the time, because I usually do it less than that. But I try not to write. I wouldn't stop at 3 if I had more to go, but it never happens that way. By 3 hours, I'm done. And like sometimes like this morning, I worked 2 hours, and I was very pleased with what I had. And I know I'm going to be there again tomorrow. It's not that I never have problems working on things. It's sometimes harder, this part or that part. But knowing that all I have to do is 3 to 5 pages a day, those are my minimums, and I rarely miss it. It makes it easier. And I don't do multiple drafts. I do that draft as well as I can, and then I do a polish. Sometimes when I'm rereading it, I'll realize, okay, that chapter sucks. I have to revise that whole chapter. But most of the time, it's not like that. At least not for me when I'm working by myself, because I know what I want pretty much. And I go to bed at night and let my subconscious fill up. I get up in the morning, I have my coffee and my breakfast, take the dog out, whatever, and then I'm up there working. I may look at my email or my fan page, and then I start writing. And I usually, just as soon as I put my fingers on it, it's gone. And I can feel the tank going dry, and I never try to push beyond that. I always like to imagine I've still got a little in the tank, so that when I come back the next day, I can just pick up right where that was. And I've also refilled all the new stuff. So I've got that open and push,
Right, psychologically. Well, the thing that I appreciate now more, having seen it and lived it and didn't think anything of it, was there would be times, especially when I was a kid, when we'd bust in Dad's office, like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm working. But we could come in and, ruin his moment. He took, and then, what's going on? Kids are here destroying my life. And then as soon as we walked out, and that's something that I definitely appreciate now, because if I get interrupted or like the dog barks or the phone, I'm instantly like, ugh, my whole rhythm is off, and it was interesting to think about Dad, who could just like, okay, and we're back.
Yeah.
And I think what that taught me, and what that is continuing to teach me, is that it is a habit and a skill, like going to the gym. It's like, if you get up in the morning or whenever people get up, and you start doing it before life and the world can come at you with everything they need, then you're more likely to have that executed. For me, my favorite time to write is getting up at 5:30 and writing until about 8 o'clock. And that is what for me really works, because the world is still asleep. Nobody needs me yet. And I can stay focused on this, this project. I just watched an interview with Neil Gaiman, and it was interesting because he was saying that he started writing longhand, not only to understand how many drafts he was doing and sort of what he was doing, but so that he wouldn't get distracted by emails and incoming things. And I don't want to write longhand. That doesn't sound, like that's for me, but there is something to doing it before the rest of the world is awake. And I understand that that's not a luxury everybody has, but it is the schedule that I've created. And if I can get it done before 8 o'clock, I wrote 3 pages this morning between 6:30 and 7:30. And I was like, and I'm done. And that's an hour. Now I've got the rest of my day to catch up on emails and do my other work and, work on other projects. But it's something that I think is important to kind of reiterate, is also that it is a learned behavior. It is a pattern. It is something that you grow, that muscle.
Read a lot.
Yeah. I was going to say too, I feel personally like writing early in the morning or late at night has the same effect too, because it's like everyone is asleep and no one's going to bother you, and you're able to just kind of get into that zen. And at least for me, I feel like when I'm in that like slightly tired, I can tap into that like subconscious part of me that the writer can take over while I'm working. And it helps.
I start real early in the morning, and I can do other things like, I make my coffee, my breakfast, I take the dog out, feed him. But I try not to let anything really be as noticed that's going on in the day. And when I go up, I'm still somewhat in the dream state. And I think that's why it happens. I'm enough out of it that I can consciously look at something going, that don't work. But I'm not so much out of it that my mind isn't willing to try outrageous things or unusual approaches. And so for me, as long as I'm in that dream state, it's fine. And after a little while, even if I start to slip out of that, I've been in it so long that I don't, it comes a point when that door will start to close. And like I said, I like to leave a little bit there. But for me, I can feel it. I know, okay, my subconscious is saying, you know what, enough of this. Let's go fix lunch.
All right. Well, you guys, I just have one more question, but I have to say this has been an absolutely incredible interview. Thank you both for coming on.
Thank you.
My last one is just, what do you have coming up?
Well, specifically, having just finished the novel, my agent's taking a look at a round of edits I just sent. So that's something I have coming up, as well as working on this new project that I can't talk too much about, but it is a new novel. And we've got some film stuff. We're sort of waiting on the IATSE conversation to move forward. So
That's the game.
yeah, I think the most concrete thing that I can actually share is the completion of the novel. And hopefully that will be into the world sooner than later.
Exciting.
Yeah, for me is a Happen Leonard novel coming out in July called Sugar on the Bones. And that's what I've got coming right now. And there's some film projects and other stuff I'm
Well,
working.
and The Thicket's coming out. So
Oh.
a book, yeah. I mean, that's the other problem is I feel like there's 30 things in the fire, which is good. But the film, The Thicket, was starring Peter Dinklage and Juliette Lewis, based on one of Dad's books, comes out September of this year. And we're going to be doing some promo and wrangling some events for that. So, that also takes up time and doing interviews that are to move the film forward, and then kind of breaking down the differences of the book versus the film. So I think there's a lot of that going on for him as well.
Also, a little later in the year, I have a Tachyon collection of Lovecraft influenced stories called In the Mad Mountains. And that's coming out, I guess, this fall.
Oh, interesting.
October. I should know this answer, but it's in October.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, everyone listening to this, please keep an eye out for all of the exciting projects coming out and go and buy this comic. All right. Once again, I had a great time talking with you guys today, and you are both welcome back on anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Kasey Lansdale.
I'm Joe Lansdale.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.